Okay, I'm delighted, pleased to introduce Phillip Frazer, who I've got to know, a delightful person, and I've known him for about 6 weeks. We've had 2 or 3 conversations, and I'm looking forward to many more. I'm going to read from the blurb he provided, but I'm sure Phillip will fill in his own biography as we go on. Phillip founded Australian pop music paper Go Set. He also founded Aussie Rolling Stone magazine, as well as The Digger. Round of applause.
For The Digger.
The Digger. In the US, he worked on the multinational Monitor with Ralph Nader, and also founded Mother Jones, The Nation, and worked on the Washington Spectator and Ode.
Not founded all of those things, but worked on them.
Worked on them. Okay. I'll give you the credit. Okay.
Or the blame.
Okay. He made a significant contribution to those particular publications. He founded an Enviro letter called News on Earth, which I understand has a subscription of what?
No, that one's dormant, shall we say.
That was dormant.
But it's being wrapped into the website I'm in the process of building here.
Okay, and we can talk about that as time goes on. And he's also participated in the High Tower Lowdown, which I think is a newsletter too, with the progressive populist Jim Hightower, who I think Hans mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
Phillip now has the good fortune to live in Currabell on the hill there, and it's a beautiful spot, and is developing a website dealing with Australian-US relations, which I'm sure we'll all be interested in. Our topic for conversation this evening, the title is Gough Whitlam and the CIA, America's long abusive affair with Australia. Please make welcome Phillip Frazer. Thanks, Phillip. I'm not sure how much of a conversation this will be, more of a question-answer. But I'll just say that you'll also have lots of opportunities to ask Phillip as many questions as you like. We'll have a good sort of 45 minutes for questions. I'm going to start on a personal note, if that's okay with you. During one of our discussions in the Ponciana Cafe, you mentioned that in 1976 you took off to America with a duffel bag. I don't know whether people have duffel bags these days. I used to have a duffel coat, but you took off with a duffel bag crammed with I don't know what. You went there in 76. Why?
Well, I had been editing, writing for and publishing magazines for 12 years at that point, starting with Lot's Wife, the Monash University student newspaper, when I was 18 or something. And I hadn't actually had a deadline further than 2 weeks in front of me at any point in time from then until 1976. So I was, and by 1976, the paper I was still editing at that point, or running, was The Digger, and it had been slammed with triple lawsuits, all of which were undefendable and would have put the thing under water, and I thought it was a good time to leave. And I went to New York for thinking I'd been there before and wasn't all that thrilled with it, but I thought it might be a good place to go for a couple of weeks. But in Amsterdam, I met some people who were subscribers to an American magazine called Ramparts way back then, which it helped me learn, that there really is an opposition party in America. It's the grassroots. And it was, anyway, they had learned through the mail that Ramparts had closed, but had given its files and so on to a new mob in New York City who were starting up what was supposed to be a sort of lefty Newsweek or Time magazine kind of thing. So I thought I'd check in with them when I got there. And they had put together a plan for this magazine called 7 Days. And they hired me, which was sort of one way of putting it. They didn't have any money, so they paid me a little bit. But they, most importantly, got me a green card. And the magazine lasted a bit longer than 7 days, but not much longer. So there I was, and I'd met some fascinating people, and behind all that, somewhere in my brain, I had the notion to do some research on what the hell happened to bring down the Whitlam government. I'd done a fair amount I'd followed that whole series of events here, you know, as many of the audience probably did. It was, one of the interesting things was all this stuff that was revealed in Parliament about the loans that they were trying to get to buy back the farm, as RFX Rex Connor used to put it. And then there were all these hundreds of letters and documents presented in the Parliament that allegedly implicated the Labor government in all kinds of bad faith dealing and dealing with crooks and making terrible mistakes and generally being a hopeless mob. So I had a bunch of those, and they had letterheads on all this copy, the stuff that had been presented as evidence, a lot of them in New York. And I started going when I had a spare moment between, you know, earning a living and so on, going to these places like Commerce International, 100 Mott Street. Well, once you get to New York, you realize Mott Street's basically in the heart of Chinatown, and 100 Mott Street was this crappy little building with, you know, a broken button on the door. And when you pressed Commerce International written in tiny handwriting, and they said, yeah, what do you want? And I said, I want to talk to Commerce International. And, what about? And I said, well, about the loans that the Labor government was trying to negotiate with you guys. Nobody here, nobody speaks English. Now, and it went on like that. Lots of these front groups, or whatever the hell they were phantoms, really.
Yes.
And I thought, now, what is it about this government, the Whitlam government, that didn't occur to them to actually send some simple human being to these addresses and knock on the door, you know? They might have saved themselves a lot of trouble. So I had both a sort of personal mission to get beyond the last 12 years of my life, and also a desire to find out what happened on November the 11th.
It was a great time to be there, wasn't it, in America in some ways, because it was going
New York was falling apart, but that was all right.
Well, the whole of America seemed to be falling apart. I mean, you had Vietnam ended in 75, the terrible catastrophe of Vietnam, Watergate, Nixon resigned in 74, you had racial strife, you had news about US involvement in Chile, the overthrow of the Salvador Allende government, and you had the energy crisis. So what sense did that give you when you were in America about what was going on politically, and how did that impact on your understanding of America at that time?
Well, during right from student days at Monash, I was interested in America, because they quite clearly were kind of, you know, that's where reality was being invented for us in some respects. And even though, you know, it used to be Britain, but now it was America, but still, you know, you had to keep up with what was happening there in order to know what was happening here. And what I got to help me learn about America were these magazines, like Ramparts, like I. F. Stone's Weekly, and then came this flood of what we used to call the alternative press. So, and with my papers here, apart from the ones you mentioned, I had one, the first of my political papers, and modestly titled Revolution. And these papers, we made arrangements with the American papers, the British, the Europeans, and even some third world countries, as we used to call them, to exchange our publications. So I knew quite a lot about America, both the alleged story of America and the one that was being told by all these opposition groups. So I knew there was a healthy oppositional community, or dozens of communities in America, and I wanted to get closer to them.
Yeah. So in 73...
So nothing about all those terrible things you were telling me. Nothing about that was surprising.
I'm sure all those
knew all that.
Those terrible things will pop up regularly through our discussion.
Right.
A big thing happened, obviously, on the 11th of September 1973, a very poignant date, given what happened in 2001. The Chilean government was overthrown. The democratically elected Marxist government under President Allende. And I went, actually, my Jennifer and I, my partner, we took a trip one day to Santiago to see whether they'd actually commemorated that event or if there was a statue to Allende. And thankfully, just in front of the palace where Allende shot himself, there is a statue of him, the great man himself. And but I'm just intrigued from at that stage. You obviously knew about the CIA involvement at that stage, or I don't know if you did, but it became common knowledge that CIA were heavily involved in this. What did that tell you about America's role?
I had a very personal interest in that because in 1970 I was made my first ever trip to the States, and I was in California, and the Qantas had helped pay for this trip. And the idea was that I'd use it to get good stories for this pop music paper, Go Set, that I found myself running. And I was talking to a woman at a press event for the Beach Boys. And hours later, she called on the phone and talked some more. She turned out to be also the publicity person for Country Joe McDonald, who was a radical folk singer, mostly famous for his "Give me an F, give me a U, give me a C, give me a K" song. But Joe, she told me, was about to go to Chile. This was in 1970 for the election. Well, he wasn't going for the election. He was going because some Americans, Yankees, North Americans, and Chileans were co-directing, co-producing a feature film set in Santiago and other parts of Chile about the subject being really revolution versus reformation or gradualism. And the main characters included a Peace Corps woman from America, a communist radical from Chile, a CIA agent from America pretending to be a businessman, and whatever. And Joe was singing songs throughout the movie as a kind of Greek chorus figure. So I said, "That's great, when's he going?" Anyway, I got on a plane the next day and went to Santiago and lived in this big tumble-down house of all these filmmakers, the Americans and the Chileans, through the next couple of weeks, including all these rallies for Allende's people. They'd set up kind of plywood and tin stages in a narrow inner urban street. So the buildings formed a sort of walls on either side of this stage, and 100,000 people would show up to hear him speak, and to hear Pablo Neruda read a poem before introducing the candidate, Allende. And because my folks I was staying with were all very well connected to the Socialist Front, I found myself like on stage, about this far away from them, taking pictures and frantically trying to understand Spanish and talk to people. Anyway, and I knew, as much as anybody could know, the likelihood was that the CIA or the Americans in the American hierarchy would do them in one way or another, whether it was by murdering them or whatever. So I was very aware of all that.
Yeah, and there had been a long history, of course. And anybody who's seen John Pilger's documentary War on Democracy, this was standard American practice in South America, wasn't it?
Not just in South America, but also in everywhere, in Europe, in Greece after the Second World War, in Iran before they knocked off Mossadegh, the prime minister, who was and put in the Shah, to make a nice pliable chap, who wasn't all that pliable actually. I later learned, but anyway, they took control, and famously also in Guatemala, where Arbenz was murdered. So and I had no doubt at all that Whitlam, Connor, and the rest of the Whitlam government were very aware of all of that. And in fact, Whitlam himself commented at some point after he was dismissed, when somebody asked him about, were you ever worried on account of what happened to Allende when he tried to nationalize the natural resources of his country? And Whitlam said, "Yes, well, I got off lightly, didn't I?" But they knew they knew that, you know, attempting to take over the national resources of your country, if you had this, let alone the kind of massive natural resources that Australia had then and mostly still does, you know, trouble will follow. They will not, you know, stand aside.
Let's talk about this this guy who got off lightly, Gough Whitlam, and let's talk about him. And he got elected in '72, and as we all know from recent events, passed away, unfortunately. It is remarkable, astonishing even, how much radical reform actually occurred under that government in a very short period of time. This is far from a complete list. Actually, if you want the complete list of his reforms, go to the Whitlam Institute website, and the reforms are really well categorised under a whole list of headings. But I've just jotted a few down here. Actually, I'll get the audience. Tell me, what did he do? Tell me about the reforms. Land rights, Medibank.
Yep.
Free education, whoopee.
No fault divorce.
No fault divorce, yes.
Public transport.
Public.
Gave the land back.
Yeah.
He what?
He gave the land back.
Give the land back, yes. Give the land back. Which one? Yep. Went to China.
Went to China, yes.
Yeah.
That's right. Yep. In fact, about 3/4 of those things he did in the first 100 hours.
With his mate.
With his mate Lance, yes.
From your perspective as somebody, as a radical journalist and living in New York, how is that program of reform perceived amongst the political elites in America?
Well, it depends on who you call the elites, but it was not well received at the White House or in the State Department. Very, very explicitly, Nixon and Kissinger were infuriated. Well, they were particularly infuriated when members of the Labor cabinet started describing their activities in Vietnam as moral outrages, abominable was the word Whitlam used. I mean, America's best allies don't use words like that, you know, not about America anyway. And they were furious. Nixon didn't invite Whitlam to come and sit and be photographed for at least a year, I think, but normally it would be an immediate courtesy. And Kissinger, I mean, see, okay, I wanted to actually get in early on the subject of the CIA in people's perceptions. If you even talk about the CIA, mostly for my entire life, you would be instantly suspected of being you know, nut bar conspiracy theorist. And to bring up the question of what role they played in the dismissal was never a popular thing to do. Perhaps its time has come, as somebody said. It's time, yeah, since we have a lot of people here interested in that long ago story. But the three things have happened in the last year that change the last couple of years. WikiLeaks, Snowden, Manning, and the release of all those documents. I mean, a lot of documents have come out in America through freedom of information and the fact that so many years have passed, they've been routinely released. But you know, certainly things got a kick ahead when WikiLeaks dumped, you know, trillions of words of. And most of it is stuff that if you were a skeptical and careful follower of American policy, you'd already know. But it's tremendously important, I think, that people all over the world were able to actually look at these pieces of paper, to read them and see in cold, hard print what these guys were on about. And the transcripts of Kissinger's meetings with people from Chile were preposterous. I mean, the guy was not the world, he still isn't, the world's great schemer and, you know, brilliant strategist and all that shit. He was actually a really unpleasant bully, thug, and he just basically said, the guy's a communist, let us, you know, kill him. Well, Mr. Secretary, I'm not sure that you can do that, kind of coming from his aides.
Yes.
And he said, oh, yeah, I know we can't. Well, do what you must set up a coup. I mean, it was not. They were not sort of mincing words here. And they were as furious, really, with Whitlam, and as much as anything for those extremely critical comments about their bombing of Hanoi and their whole policy and activities in Vietnam. But underneath it, what they were, first of all, they didn't expect Labor to win. The US consulate had assured them that even though there'd be a big swing, this was just a bit of a blip, and that the Conservatives would hold on, the Business Party would hold on, and everything will be fine, and so on. So even though there's some evidence that they sent money to the Liberal National Party, as it was at the time, for the election campaign, they didn't. It wasn't clearly it wasn't enough, but they didn't really think it was going to happen. So when and it didn't happen by very much either. The Labor Party could have been knocked off if they'd had another, or if the Labor Party hadn't just temporarily seduced Rupert Murdoch to be on their side for a few months. Sorry, where were we on that one?
Let's fast forward to the dismissal and to the role of the CIA. The dismissal happened, I've got the time here, 1:15 p.m., which is probably in the bar shirt, I suspect. No, I shouldn't say that for Robert Kerr, but on the 11th of November 1975. When did you first get a hint of CIA involvement in the downfall of the Whitlam government?
Ironically, the first person who made a public fuss about it was Gough Whitlam. But even though the sort of current mythology still inside the Labor Party is that Whitlam himself never thought this happened and never thought it was important. But he was the first member of the parliamentary party or any significant person in a political position in Australia to bring it up. Now, credit where it's due, it was Brian Toohey, Marion Wilkinson, and a couple of other people at the National Times, and a few other mainstream journalists who worked tirelessly to find out what was going on. I mean, they were good, but they were also well positioned to get the leaks, because there were people inside the bureaucracy, people who, even folks who had some kind of strange relationship with the CIA itself, like Des Ball, a terrific lifelong writer and studier of intelligence operations based in Canberra. And these guys knew that there was some stuff, furious cables were being sent back and forth once Whitlam had personally opened up the can of worms, shall we say. He was under fire on so many fronts. His budget was being blocked. The press had turned against him. They were, treating the search for the loan monies as a scandal. Well, there's nothing wrong with looking for loans per se. So, but he was being hammered on every front, and including that Labor Party and Labor unions might be looking for funds for themselves from, heaven forbid, the Arabs. In fact, their intention in trying to borrow billions of dollars, was to borrow money to buy back the Australian energy and resource industry. And at a gathering sponsored by a local Church of England, I've recently discovered, in Adelaide in late 75, or September maybe, Whitlam was, some wag in the audience, or some journalist gave him a bit of crap about the Labor Party, searching for money from the Arabs. And Whitlam said, well, at least we're not taking money from the CIA, like the Deputy Prime Minister is, or the head of Doug Anthony was who he was referring to. And what had happened was that, I believe what happened was that Brian Toohey at the Times got that tip that there was this chap named Richard Stallings who had a title of, Trade Commissioner or something at the US consulate in Canberra, and had been there for years. And what his real job was CIA station chief for Australia, with particular responsibility for looking after the Americans' prime asset in Australia, which is the Pine Gap base near Alice Springs. And now Stallings was friendly with quite a few people in Canberra, the Labor Party politicians as well as coalition people. But Doug Anthony, local man, had rented a house that he owned in Canberra to Stallings, which is perhaps not all that huge a deal, but it's certainly an extremely provocative thing to do. It's a politically stupid thing to do. And Whitlam had been informed of this. And then he said, well, how do we know this? Give me the list of all the CIA agents in Australia. So his people went off and asked for that list from Sir Arthur Tang, who was head of the Secretary of the Department of Defence, one of those, sirs that run things in Canberra, and he'd been in that kind of job for 20 years. So Tang provided a list. Whitlam looked at it, and this guy Stallings was not on the list. So he said, now, I have great faith in this tip-off I've got, so this list is bullshit. Get me the real one. And Sir Arthur Tang said, well, I could, but I would have to tell the CIA that I was giving you that list. And Whitlam, slightly bizarrely, kind of said, what the hell? Give me the list. So Stallings' name is on the list. So Whitlam repeated it and stirred the possum a bit more. There's conjecture to this day as to why he did that, but he was such a careful man and a legally, meticulous guy in some ways, but he had a history of throwing one-liners in at various critical moments in order to see what the hell happened, really. So what happened in that case was that the State Department, the White House, i.e. Nixon, Kissinger, and the CIA all categorically denied that Stallings was a member of the CIA. And Whitlam's got the list. And
what date was that? What date did he get?
We're talking in the first days of November 1975.
So quite near to the end point.
As I said, there's all this other stuff, raining down on Whitlam, and half his cabinet had been fired. Some say for bogus reasons, some were set up by who knows who. We can, there's details that we do know about all that stuff. But he was, I think, pretty interested in stirring that particular subject because it has a great impact on people if they think that well, he hoped it would anyway, that the CIA was involved in things. And he was pissed off personally, Whitlam, because he'd learned that the Pine Gap base, which its function was then and still is to sort of suck up, well, the satellite up above it on a geostationary orbit sucks up massive amounts of private communications. Back in the 70s, it was Soviet and Chinese, and those were the main targets. And that stuff would then be beamed down to Pine Gap, beautifully free of electronic interference, out there in the middle of Australia. And this huge complex of buildings and 1,000 people working there, most of them Americans, and Aussies were not allowed in to certain parts of the building. Even members of Parliament weren't allowed in. So he discovers that this was actually a CIA base, and it wasn't simply designed to, look at the weather. The original rationale was ludicrous, but it had occurred to him that he was a base that could very well be a number one target for Soviet attack in the event of a war. And we, who were hosting it, had no access to it, no knowledge of what it was really doing, and they were lying to him about it. He didn't like that. So he kept at it, mentioning this, and Sir Arthur Tang, the poobah of public service, said to him, you are going to have, Mr. Prime Minister, you're going to have to answer the questions that were put to the House by Lynch of the National Party, I think was the leader at the time, about this allegation and related ones that Stallings was CIA and that Pine Gap was CIA. And you're going to have to tell them that this is unfounded. Now, Whitlam had a reputation for not lying. At least he liked to think he had one. And he said, no, I'm not going to do that. In fact, I'm going to present all this paperwork to answer those questions in the Parliament tomorrow. This was on the 10th of November. He never got there. Now, was there any more going to that? Well, yes, there was. The head of, well, Nixon, Kissinger had already made these public statements that what the Prime Minister's talking about isn't true. So he was about to publicly call them liars. Secondly, the head of the South Asia division of the CIA, a bloke by the name of Ted Shackley, whose nickname was the coup master for his long and dedicated work on behalf of the CIA in Vietnam, Laos, and other parts of the world. That's where he had been immediately prior to being sent to Australia, not sent to Australia, but being made CIA chief for us. So Shackley composed and sent a cable to the ASIO, ASIS, that's ASIO is our domestic, ASIS is our foreign security agencies, that said, I could bring up the exact wording, but essentially what it said was, unless we can be assured that the Prime Minister will say no more, will release no more information about the identities of CIA agents or about the activities of the CIA in Australia, we will be forced to cease all cooperation and information sharing with the Australian security and defence agencies immediately. And this is like the Pope issuing a private threat to excommunicate a whole country. The UKSAR, UK, USA, New Zealand, Australia, Canada group were the Five Eyes, the five Anglo, English-speaking, club, unacknowledged, but nevertheless enormously important from the Second World War onwards. Nobody had been evicted, nobody had been excommunicated. It's hard, I couldn't say for sure that nobody had been issued with such a threat, but it's enormously significant action, short of actually excommunicating, threatening to, was a tremendously important political manoeuvre. And that too was, on the 10th of November, or actually I think it was the 8th. Now, unbeknownst to Ted Shackley, the bloke in Langley, Virginia, who sent that cable, he should have known this, but Whitlam had fired the head of ASIO not long before that, not necessarily because he was politically unreliable, but it was some sex scandal that he was involved in, I think. But he put in an interim head who clearly owed everything to Gough Whitlam. I mean, he was not a well-groomed, well-connected, well-controlled member of the club of international Anglo spies. He was a bloke who'd risen up in the public service, and now he was temporarily leader of ASIO. So he sent the cable to the Prime Minister, which would have never been the intention of Shackley and co. But it was also, that's alleged by people around Whitlam, that he got to see the cable. What is also alleged, and there's more evidence for this, is that Sir Arthur Tang, had his chief scientist who liaised on Pine Gap with the Americans meet with probably in person, but if not, then by phone, John Kerr on the 10th of November. And Kerr has had a long history of working in those kind of, anodyne-sounding organisations, lawyers for peace and justice in the world or something, that were CIA fronts. He'd been involved in security work at the end of the Second World War, which is not to say he was a bad person just for that, but he was a bloke who knew about security business and liked to be a member of the club, really. John Kerr wanted to be a member of lots of clubs. It's kind of his mission, really. Now, the question of whether that tipped them over the edge, tipped him over the edge, I mean, lots of things tipped John Kerr over the edge, but was that the thing that finally gave him enough guts to do it?
That's an interesting question, isn't it? Because here you have the context is incredibly fraught, isn't it? You have, Whitlam, about to disclose a list of CIA operatives. You have threats of him talking openly about CIA involvement at Pine Gap. You have possible severance of intelligence cooperation between Australia and the US. These are major, major events, and obviously rising, escalating political tension around all this. You said in your article, and I've picked out this quote, there was the weekend before the dismissal, Sir Arthur Tange and others met with John Kerr. And you said, and I'll quote you here, you said, something that weekend changed Kerr's mind about his old friend Gough Whitlam. I think that friendship, by all accounts, had actually ebbed a little. So what was actually said? What do we know? I know nobody disclosed it, but who was present and what was said at that meeting?
The invitation list has not been published, but there are half a dozen people who would know, who've said over the years that the principal activity was this guy, John Farrens, his name is, the scientist at the Department of Defence, explaining to Kerr with the cable from Ted Shackley, saying this is what we've got, and the implications of this are blah, blah, blah. If we lose all that information we're getting, sharing with the Americans, and presumably, even though he would have known that some of the information coming through Pine Gap, for example, was not being shared. That's another thing that pissed off Whitlam. He realised that we were not getting all the stuff that went through Pine Gap, that the Americans were keeping it. Well, they were sending it directly from Pine Gap to America, and then whatever they wanted us to know, they were giving us. Now they were threatening to shut down the whole shebang. I'd like to add one thing about Pine Gap that is very important too. The agreement to joint base, as it was called, build the base and manage it, was signed in the 60s. And it had a provision that nothing about this would be revised or up for grabs, up for discussion really, until December 1975. And at that point, and from that point onwards, either party to the agreement could give 12 months' notice of either abandoning it or, making changes. And Whitlam had said he was not going to change it, he would renew it. But that was before all this other stuff hit the fan in September, October, November 75. So there was more than just the release of names. In fact, the CIA people that I wound up talking to and people who know about them said, in the end, the naming of the names, who gives a shit? These people are just dispensable. I mean, Dick Cheney threw one of them under the bus over the Iraq, Nigeria nuclear affair, Valerie Plame, famous case. But those guys were, replaceable. But what was really at stake was their ability to hang on to Pine Gap.
Yeah. Okay. I want to fast forward a little bit. I'm just getting conscious how hot it is, and people probably are dying to ask questions. So I'm going to give you a lot of time to do that. I just want to pick up two things, if I may, just in the wash-up of the dismissal in 1975. One thing really struck me when I read through your stuff, and which was in 1977, President Jimmy Carter actually dispatched the Secretary of State, Warren Christopher.
At that stage, he was Under Secretary of State.
I beg your pardon. He dispatched him to Australia to meet with Gough Whitlam and Richard Butler. Is that right?
Yeah.
Could you tell us about that meeting?
Yeah, this actually was not in my original article because it took place before I wrote the article, but I didn't know about it. Nobody knew about it much. But when Whitlam had been beaten, Malcolm Fraser was Prime Minister. Whitlam was head of the opposition still, so he had a small office and staff. He got a message that said a message from Jimmy Carter's office. Carter had just been elected president. And Carter's message said, we want to meet you in a such and such a hotel at the near the Canberra airport on such and such a time and date. And that will be my envoy will be Warren Christopher. And so Gough went there with Richard Butler, who is his principal private secretary and a distinguished diplomat to this day. And they received Warren Christopher's verbal message from Jimmy. And then they drove back to their office, and the third member of their office staff was waiting there, desperately eager to hear what the hell this was all about. That was Whitlam's press secretary by the name of Kerry O'Brien. And Kerry had told me this story only about 6 months ago, but right after Whitlam died, well, what Kerry told me was that Whitlam and Richard Butler had slightly different interpretations of what it was that Carter was apologising for exactly. And Butler was saying it was their interference in the dismissal. And Whitlam was saying, we can't be sure of that. So, lo and behold, last month, or late October, I think it was, Butler had finally opened up a little bit in an interview with Max Such in the Australian Financial Review, barely reported anywhere else. But what he says is that he had no doubt then, and he has no doubt today, that that's what Carter wanted to apologise for. And that should have been front page headlines, I think. It may be an old story, folks, but that's pretty damn big. I might have even been there. But,
yeah. One of the features of what Philip's describing, I guess, is in this whole series of events is irony. There's irony, there's contradiction, there's doubt, there are shadows, there are shadowy figures. But one of the most peculiar things I've found, fast-forwarding to last year, is when Malcolm Frazer, or Kerr's Kerr, as Gough Whitlam famously referred to him as, wrote a book called Dangerous Allies. You'll remember that, and a very radical book proposing, amongst other things, that Australia should consider severing its relationship militarily with the United States. What else did he have to say in that book, the famous...
Shut down Pine Gap, or at least renegotiate it exactly in the way that the Americans were scared Whitlam might do, for the same reason, that it makes us a target. We will be bombed by whomever it may be, without any recourse. We'll have had nothing to do with it, and we will not be consulted. And he's right. It's a tragedy for all of us that it took him 40 years to figure it out. But and the other ultimate irony on that front, I think, is that I don't know if he mentioned this in his book, but in an article he wrote about 2 months ago in an American magazine called The National Interest, which you can access online, he says the same thing, in effect. We should get rid of our relationship with the US. The ANZUS Treaty should be abandoned. New Zealand pulled out of it years ago. And we should cancel the agreement on Pine Gap, and we should cancel those bloody bases that Gillard and Rudd agreed to put in Darwin, for the same reason, that we should not be held, we shouldn't be bombed for shit that wasn't our doing. In any event, in this article in The National Interest, Frazer, not Kerr, Frazer, said, and if we do that, if we cancel the ANZUS Pact and Pine Gap and Darwin, bear in mind that the New Zealanders did that, pulled out of ANZUS, and crucially, they were not expelled from the UKSAR, 5 Anglo countries' intelligence community. They were not cut off from shared information. Somehow Malcolm has absorbed the gravity of that threat and is now using it to back up his argument that we shouldn't be scared of getting out of the pact. It's a subtle irony, I admit, but it's a fairly spectacular one. But before, just a last note on Malcolm, before we get too excited, Malcolm also believes, he still, by the way, argues that back in the 70s, there really was a terrible threat, that we really were in danger. The world was going to be overtaken by the Soviets unless the Americans stood up to them. And that's different from today. So that's why he's flipped. But it's a very thin argument, and he even looks more pained than he usually does when he makes it. But his never mind, let's not wake up on Malcolm anymore.
Yeah, Malcolm. Let's just kind of come to, I've got 3 remaining questions, and with your indulgence, I'll just have fairly brief replies if possible. 3 or more decades on, here we are. And I suppose one of the obvious questions that arises is, if we ever have a government in Australia who's able to prosecute a radical political agenda within the context of a liberal democracy like Australia, what lessons can we draw from what happened to Gough Whitlam in terms of pursuing that kind of agenda? Is it possible to pursue that agenda without US interference?
Well, okay, it wasn't just US, by the way. It was multinational corporations from Britain and other parts of the world who... And it wasn't just all about spies. I mean, the first and the largest sin of the Whitlam government was attempting to buy back our natural resources. And they had the brilliant idea, for, a bunch of Labor Party blokes, it was pretty good, that they would avoid getting murdered like Allende or whatever happened to him, being killed, by not simply nationalising all of our resources by fiat, but rather buying them back on the stock market. What could be more capitalist than that? That's what they were going to do with the 4 or 6 or however many $1 billion they were trying to collect in the Middle East, and it wasn't quite so insane as it probably sounds to a lot of people. The Middle East was awash in petrodollars, as they were called. There was billions floating around, and the Saudis and Iranians and Kuwaitis were trying to figure out what to do with it. Now, this to the lessons learned thing. Guys like Jim Cairns and Rex Connor and a couple of others of the cabinet had some understanding of finance and international finance and politics, and they thought that they could get somewhere with, say, Saudi Arabia. And Cairns went to some length to negotiate a deal with them where they'd lend Australia $1 billion or whatever, and Australia would sign an agreement that they would get food from Australia, guaranteed, regardless of anything else that happened. Like the next week, Kissinger announced that if these OPEC characters kept withholding the petrol, the oil, our oil, under their sand, then it may be necessary to launch a war, an attack on the oil fields. So then you got Cairns saying, well, we might make a deal with the people who currently technically own these oil fields with a mutual support basis, and then the Americans might bomb them. How does this work? And I talked to Cairns for a very long time in a couple of interviews, and I hadn't read them until yesterday, actually. More than 40 years later, I keep good files, and I read them, and what struck me was how naive they were. He himself said so. Of course, Jim Cairns was notoriously naive on many fronts, but on this one, they were not they hadn't remotely the experience they needed to have to go around the world borrowing billions of dollars. They had a smart idea to borrow and buy the shares in the stock market thing, but even the lefties didn't get that international capital is not going to lend you the money to take back things that they believe belong to them anyway. It just wasn't going to happen. So incompetence was the main thing that was levelled as a charge against the Whitlamites, and they were in many ways. But most governments are incompetent. We don't have to look very far, do we? I think the naivete and lack of real-world experience was a big issue. Now, that's probably not so true today. I think we get people make it up to the top levels of politics in all the parties. Some of them, at least, have been around the world quite a few times. Some of them, occasionally, one of them speaks Chinese. So there's a certain amount of sophistication that wasn't there back then. But another thing Cairns said all those years ago, when I said to him, now, having gone through all this stuff, who would you say really shapes the way things work in our country, or any country for that matter? Is it the political leaders? Is it the entrenched bureaucrats? Is it the community people, or is it business people? Who's determining the shape of our society more than the other? And he said, business people. The rest of us are just sort of dithering around.
Can I pick you up on that just for a sec? Which was about one of the things we talked about before was that the destabilisation, if you like, of the Whitlam government occurred not simply through shadowy CIA spies, but actually through some very simple corporate economics, which was the flight of capital out of the country. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, as soon as they announced, the Whitlam government announced, which was about 1973, this plan to not just take back the ownership of our natural resources, but Rex Connor had a plan to he set up an institution of government to build 10,000 miles of pipelines across Australia to move the gas. But he was going to move them to our homes and to be processed and exported with the value added at our end. He controversially said we'd be willing to sell the uranium, but he would also process it here so that we got the money from the middle part of the transactions rather than just selling dirt at dirt prices. He wanted to do the same thing with bauxite and turn it into alumina and sell that rather than just bauxite. That, I think, was the scary thing for the multinational corporations and the banks and so on. So once that was out of the bag, and Connor had he was not in the least bit phased about confronting people with this plan. As Jim Cairns said, Connor came out of the New South Wales Labor Party right. He didn't give a shit what anybody thought. He just did it. But I think he more than anybody else triggered this movement, which was in a space between 1973 and 1975. The amount of investment coming into Australian industry and Australian resource exploitation, extraction rather, from abroad went from about 75 or 80% down to about 30 or less. And the amount of money that was being made by multinational corporations in Australia, which they had the percentage of their profits in Australia that they reinvested in Australia, dropped from about 50% to about 17%. And this was in the news then, but like any news story, if it can't be compressed into one day, yesterday the entire 2/3 of our investment income vanished, that would be in the daily paper. But this took place only over a matter of months, the majority of it. And it was called by the Labor faithful the strike by capital, or a strike of capital, which is what it was. And that, as much as anything, plus the world oil, the oil crisis, there are other external factors, but really the attempt to borrow the money and so on and so forth was all the things around that was what brought the wrath of international capital and made unemployment skyrocket. People will argue that Cairns as Treasurer, allowed wages to rise at a certain rate much higher than da-da-da. But if you just make those kind of macro changes to the available money in the country, you screw the place.
Yeah.
Which was what that's exactly what they were trying to do.
Yeah. Questions around all this. We could be here for the next 3 weeks, obviously asking questions, but
No.
it's too hot. It's too hot under these art lights. But the question I want to ask finally is a two-part question. One is, given we know what we know, or given the known unknowns, as Donald Rumsfeld might have it, why has there been no Royal Commission into something as big as this? It is a huge allegation, if we want to call it that. The second part of that question is, what can people do in this room to contribute, possibly to a public debate or to some kind of action, to kind of deal with what was obviously an enormous miscarriage of justice in some ways, if I can use that term?
On the Royal Commission, it was demanded in Parliament by opposition leader Gough Whitlam himself. Again, the hierarchy of the Labor Party today keeps repeating. Don Watson repeated it in the Monthly. Kep Enderby repeated it on television when he was interviewing Peter Carey, that Whitlam didn't think this was important stuff. Well, yes, he did. He demanded a Royal Commission on the involvement of the CIA in Australian politics. He wrote it in his column in the Herald Sun. I mean, it wasn't like some off-the-cuff remark or something that he was alleged to have said. He put it in his book. He himself, though, became I call him the amnesiac in chief, because he then just sort of withered away when it came to addressing the whole question of CIA or American involvement. And my theory about that is that he's just mortified by being at the thought that some of the people who pushed him off the boat were a bunch of, roughneck Yankees being knocked over by Sir Arthur, Sir Garfield, Sir John, and Sir whoever else it was. It was infuriating, but not undignified. What can we all do? Well, I think that his very big picture, very briefly, that this stuff about the business people running the planet, yes, running our country and America, is true. The Hightower Lowdown newsletter that I started with Jim Hightower, when he and I first talked about it and were trying to establish if we're on common ground, I said he had said that he had a plan to demand that all members of Congress in America wear their sponsors' logos on their suits modelled after the NASCAR race drivers. And that's a program we pursued. So, we can keep voting, Green or Labor, and keep pressuring the federal level or the state level, and we will. But I believe that those institutions are well and truly in the grip of not just local business leaders, but international business. And, their grip will fade. Their time is surely, their days are numbered. But, we've been saying that for a long time, and we don't have very many days if we don't do something dramatic. And I think the best we all can do is to work to create alternatives in the real world at our level, local level. Things like the, Northern Rivers. I noticed Alison Crook was here somewhere. Is Alison there? The name of the organisation? Right, okay. But there are, we need more of that. We need more of these organisations that are local, sustainable, community-based, innovative. And one step towards getting them is to bring people together to talk about them, and not just the usual suspects. We need to reach out, as Alison is doing, with engineers and musicians and business people and students, and talk to each other about how we can remake institution. If we'd done that, for example, around the redevelopment of Byron, I mean, the council, I'm not going to get into that in detail, but they seem to spend a hell of a lot of time kind of saying no and not quite knowing what to do. But there are people who've been particularly bad in that. if we had had a group, a discussion group, a planning group of multi-talented people, they don't have to be elected to the council and go through the nightmare of being councillors, but presenting plans, innovative and creative ones, and then making them happen, undermines, certainly in the United States, I lived in that 2-week trip I took to New York. I ended up living there for 35 years, and I worked with all kinds of political groups, and the best of them are at the local level, and they do things that have powerful repercussions. We need to do more. There need to be thousands of them, not tens of them. So, that's the answer to that one. What can we do? Organise. Okay.
Just want to say thank you to Philip. I'm sure that we spent 36 years living in New York and contributing widely to American radical debate, and I'm sure his energy and commitment and passion and intellect is sorely missed over there. I'm sure he's still got his contacts, and I'm sure he's gone.
No, they've all forgotten. Come on.
I doubt it. I'm sure he's gone global. But thankfully, he's here, and he's in Kurabel, and he's part of Mullumbimby, and isn't that wonderful? Thank you for your contribution.
Thank you, Richard.
For more information, visit kurabelridge.com or go to Facebook and search Ngara Institute. That's Ngara Institute. Music provided by Vic Manuel, who can be found at myspace.com/VicManuel00.